in a way that you can get access. And what happens to fees and costs if you have to move all of a sudden? So you want to get into your relationships thinking that someday, and someday they will end. And that will help you through the management process. I actually, even though we're very good in the origination phase, I would suggest that we're not as good as we could be in this area, thinking about the end, because it's not the deal, it's the performance, and then it's eventually the exit. And that's how you can protect your internal clients. So you want to rate the service provider risk when you're going in, and you may do some or all of these, but you also may have a self-service model where you don't perform everything. Some procurement departments do everything for the organization, and so in services organizations that may not be practical. So you need to have a methodology that is quite adaptable for other people and that they know what to do. Site visits, especially now with travel dollars being cut down, and other creative ways you can have a site visit. Excuse me. I don't know how you can have a site visit remotely, but there's probably a way with technology. And have you checked the references, and can you do that ongoing? A lot of people are unfamiliar with this CICA. I guess actually it's 5970 now to match the SAS 70. But that is an assessment of the internal controls of the organization. And if they're unable to provide one, that might be a bit of a warning signal, especially in outsourcing. Excuse me, I'll just get some water. Assessing a financial condition. Now, I'm lucky I come from a banking background, so I'm pretty familiar with how to do that. I've talked to a number of people that they say companies may not have a good handle on that. So it's a financial condition when you're getting in, but you also need to know how to look at underneath the covers on an ongoing basis. This next one is from the Madoff Ponzi scheme. Did nobody notice that their auditor was not really commensurate with the size and complexity of the business? So they had an accounting firm that was really monumentally unsuitable for what they were doing, which should have been a warning signal. And that's something you may want to keep an eye on now. There should not be a disconnect, because you want to make sure that when the auditors go in, if it's outright fraud, they may not detect it, but if there are problems, they will. The ongoing business viability, when you're doing an assessment, do you look at whether or not they're in a competitive position? Where do they compete in comparison with other companies in their industry? Who are their key officers? Do you know anything about them? And basically, you want to ask all these questions because you're going to track some of these things later. Do you test or review some of their internal controls? If they have access to your data, and particularly regulated data, you really need to go in and stress test whether or not they can control it, because the security breaches that you can get into, even with a very small relationship, can damage your company really very seriously, and this is not the time to be in the headlines for having lost customer data. So you want to look at those information security controls. Specific contractual terms and conditions. I worked with a company lately that had a very large department, both for disaster recovery and for business continuity planning in their company. They had never talked to the procurement department to see what was in the contracts of the suppliers, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So if you have access to this, those types of resources internally, have them have a look at the provisions, and they shouldn't probably be the same for everything. So for example, if you have a large outsourcer, not only should they have a BCP plan, they should actually provide a copy to you, and you should actually participate in some of the testing from time to time, either annually or every couple of years, to make sure that they can invoke the plan and actually make it work. Process documentation, the infrastructure and the environment, are they continuing to invest? Because that's what's happening right now. People are not spending their capital. So are they continuing to invest as their business grows or as the shape of their business changes? Because that can have a big influence on whether or not they can perform for you. And subcontractor controls, do you even know who they're outsourcing to? So we heard earlier today that those smaller suppliers are the ones that are really in a lot of trouble. And you'll find that the large companies, they have extensive outsourcing arrangements with subcontractors. So you need to define what do you mean by a subcontractor, and what do you need to know about them, and what is their process to manage them. Because They're like you, right? They're big companies, lots on the go. They don't manage their subcontractors' relationships maybe necessarily any more closely than you, and in fact, maybe less. And also, where are they subcontracting to? Which countries? And what's the geopolitical environment of the country where they're dealing? Because that's something that can just sneak up out of nowhere and really get you. So once you know all those things, now you're getting into more steady state for ongoing management. And you as procurement people, you can specify what needs to be done. So I would say some very basics. You know, you have to inspect what you expect. If you don't check it up from time to time, you're never going to know what's going on. But nor do your business partners know what they should be looking for. So I think just being prescriptive and giving them the tools, the guides, the policies, and also training them and being there as a resource to help them as they learn is a very important thing. So, you know, do they know what to do with service level agreements? I worked with a very large company recently, and it astounded me that procurement completely delegated responsibility for service level agreements to the business, who may not ever deal with them more than once or twice a year. So to craft them with no professional help, it just seemed like a strange thing. So they may not know how to craft them, and then, you know, for measures that really matter, and are they even looking at them when the results come in? Another source of problems often is the invoices. If you can't, you need to help the business figure out how billing formats, and can they understand their invoices, because they'll delegate that off to a fairly clerical person and to go through and check the invoices, and it may not have any real substance, so they don't really know what they're paying for, and they may feel like they're being nickeled on when in fact everything's within contract. And the other thing is internet monitoring, and this is one place I would really recommend you start looking for offshore help on these types of things. You know, you could set up an offshore team in a low-cost environment to actually take your supplier base and monitor the internet for news about that company every day, because it's not going to happen in the business units, I can guarantee you. But if you have a small central team, depending on the number of suppliers you're monitoring, you may only need 2 or 3 people. But they'll keep an eye and start to look for news, either positive or negative, and make sure that whoever owns that contract is informed. And it's not an expensive thing to do, but I really think it's a great practice. So then the periodic reviews, that's another thing that just doesn't happen. So depending on the risk level, you're going to risk rate them as high, moderate, lower, or I don't care. And especially for the ones that are higher, you want to have more intensity in your reviews in terms of what you look at. So it's more frequent and more intense. So you're going to look at things like, you know, you went through due diligence, how much of that are you going to do again? So you might actually go through and do another financial risk assessment. You may send out your information security people to have a look at things. You may decide every couple of years I need to have a site visit, see what's really going on. I actually heard a story about one time about someone who contracted a company, and eventually some years later they went down the road. It turned out that they were entirely outsourced. They really just had a shell operation, and they didn't know until they did a site visit. So every now and again you might want to check in. So these are the kinds of things that you did getting in, but you might want to actually put a process in place to do it again. And procurement can help with those things because you usually have processes well set up. Make sure they still have insurance coverage. Do they have the same people in place? Have you looked at the key officers? Is there anything interesting going on? Especially if you're regulated, if you sell into the U.S., you're probably regulated. You're also subject to the Patriot Act, etc. You just want to make sure you don't end up somehow or other in the OFAC list. And also, things change. So can you help them do an assessment in terms of what are their needs in their current relationship, and how did that change from what was there? In procurement, I've often gone into business units. They're really annoyed with a relationship they want to change. It's going to be very expensive. And how many times have you gone through and done a thorough review, and it ends up that you just have to tweak a few things, and you have a happy marriage again? I mean, think of the value you've added to your organization by taking them through a logical process and fixing minor problems. Another thing is that, you know, business changes as well, and the structure of the contract and the incentives for your supplier may be quite contrary to your current business strategy, and sometimes that's the source of the problem.